Okay, I think we're good to go. Welcome everyone to our session on diversity and commissioning. My name is Claire Litt, and I am a senior commissioning editor for Liverpool University Press. I have recently served as co-chair of the Association of University Presses Committee for Equity, Justice, Inclusion and Belonging, together with my co-chair of this session and of the committee, Valerie Guanini. Val, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Valerie Guanini. I am the head of EDIB for Cambridge University Press, the academic division. My E is for equity. Unlike my colleagues here, I do not have a background in commissioning editor. And so my role is purely holistic. I look at the overall EDIB initiatives for Cambridge. So I more likely will follow the trail of a book from beginning to the end. So when I look at diversity, I'm looking at how it's commissioned, to how it's being handled, to the wording, to the accessibility of it, and also to who's selling it and who's buying it. So that's my role at Cambridge, and I'm handing it back to Claire.
Okay. Thanks, Val. I'm going to spend as little time as possible on this intro section. Our wonderful speakers have a lot to say, and we want to maximise time for them and questions afterwards. But in short, we hope this session will be thought-provoking and challenging, whilst also offering some practical examples of good practice and insightful reflections. So without further ado, our panelists. Paul Stevens is publisher for Bristol University Press, where he commissions books on science and technology studies and research methods and practices. Iram Sati is a commissioning editor for Bloomsbury Professional. Iram has worked in the publishing industry for over 10 years and has recently launched Iram the Little Publisher to offer impartial guidance for budding authors from underrepresented groups, and she'll be telling us a bit more about that later. Delana Spencer is senior commissioning editor at Sage, where she commissions education textbooks, professional books for teachers, and social justice titles in the new series, Social Science for Social Justice. And now I'm going to hand over to Paul.
All right, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to join the panel. Right, so it's no great revelation to say that academia is deeply hierarchical. A history of any discipline is going to be one of networks of patronage and centers of authority. Sociologists have described the worlds of our authors and readers as invisible colleges. But for those who are on the margins of academia, those invisible colleges have material force. They're power structures that enclose privilege and exclude diversity of representation and expression. Commissioning editors are the gatekeepers in what's essentially a certification business. We have an interdependent relationship with the academy, and whether we like it or not, our editorial decisions reinforce those structures. So we find ourselves in a bind. It's one thing to identify privilege, but it's quite another to challenge it when it's in our better interests to go along with the state of affairs. So habits get formed. So how many times have we heard others say, or have ourselves said, oh, this book's going to do very well because the author has a platform? But what gets ingrained when we make these statements? Who gets overlooked? And when an author doesn't have platform, we make vague appeals to the market in order to justify our decisions to reject a proposal or to invest less in the book's promotion. But when do we stop to consider that markets aren't sort of neutral realities that sit out there, but are things that are socially made? It can be difficult to change our habits, and I'm well aware of my position as a socially and economically advantaged white man in this conversation. And I should probably also say that I'm speaking in a personal capacity and I don't necessarily represent the views of my employer, but I do hope that this panel is going to open up some questions that we can sort of think through together, even if they make us feel a little uncomfortable. Now, it's been encouraging to see what's happening around the industry, although anyone who's read Delena's bookseller article will agree we've got an awful long way to go. But with that said, I do think that the majority of us are progressive and sincere and well-informed people. And it's been especially heartening to see initiatives like Even Up, involving the various British and Irish university presses. And those of us who attended the Inclusive Workplace session yesterday heard some very constructive efforts being made by Bloomsbury. But when I'm speaking with authors, I keep coming back to a question, which is, what do we actually mean when we say diversity? Just as the market is a thing that's made, should we be thinking of diversity as some sort of universal, unalloyed good to aspire to? Or should we recognize it as something that's rather more fragile, a sort of a negotiated outcome of our shared politics and values? And on the one hand, to ask about the definitions is rather navel-gazing, because after all, what does it really matter if diversity gets put on the agenda in the first place? But on the other, I would suggest that it does matter, because our policies and our outreach initiatives, the things that we create contain our values and our assumptions and our habits. So I would invite us to reflect on whose idea of diversity we find ourselves championing. So when we think of the faces of the people, the would-be authors that we're including in our efforts, who do we not see? For instance, can we be criticized for being insufficiently attentive to matters of class? I would say yes, and I'm very happy that Bristol University Press recognizes socioeconomic background as part of its DEI mission. But elsewhere, given the unrest in UK higher education, should we be asking if our DEI statements should be broadened to include those who are precariously employed by the institutions that reinforce those networks of power, or who feel shut out of the academy entirely? Some companies have been accused of greenwashing, and I would say that our industry needs to do everything in its power to avoid suspicions of DEI washing. Now, how do we avoid this? Something of an open question, but one thing that we might reflect and think critically on is sort of the set of activities that quantify our DEI efforts. So, for example, as we all know, editors love to work towards targets, but there's a risk that if left unexamined, diversity becomes something that can only ever be imagined as a set of KPIs, leading to this sort of performative exercise where commissioning outcomes just reflect the targets that are being set. Metrics by themselves aren't bad, but I would say let's not allow quantitative measures to cover the qualitative aspects of DEI. Yes, use them to bring people into the room, but let's also think about what we can do to foster a sense of belonging once our authors are there. And in any event, I'd say it's safe to assume that the majority of editors working right now very keenly feel that moral responsibility to diversify their commissioning. And I certainly feel supported by my press in doing so. And again, we see very positive developments, whether it's Even Up or partnerships with organizations like Research for Life. But I ask you, should it be left to individual editors or individual publishers or industry association working groups? How can we use this foundation to take things further? How might collective action help us to do more and on a bigger scale? Can we as a collective industry work with universities, funding bodies and other groups to provide further reaching and more consequential forms of moral and material support for authors who are otherwise on the margins of that invisible college or who feel locked out of it entirely? I say individual action isn't inconsequential, but habits are ingrained, and we can break them. Collective action requires vision and leadership and yes, also risk, but I would ask if it's too risky not to try.
Thanks very much, Paul. Lots of wonderful insights there. and what you say about the moral imperative that editors feel chimes very much with my own work, and I think everybody on the panel. So Iram is now going to take up the baton with her own direct experience of addressing these sorts of challenges, both within her commissioning work and her career. Over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I just want to preface this to say that I am not representing my current employer or previous employers that I've worked for. So in complete honesty, I was a little slow in intentionally thinking about diversity in commissioning when I first became a commissioning editor. I regret that that was the case. However, at the time, I was just thinking about how I was going to meet my commissioning target when I had very few leads. So I was first promoted to commissioning editor in 2017, working on academic law. And there are a few contextual highlights that I want to point out regarding that role. So I was the only female commissioning editor in the team. So we have a point about gender diversity. I was the only person of colour in that team. There's a point around racial diversity. And I was the only person under the age of 30 in that team. So there's a point around age and generational diversity. Within that role, I felt I had a lot to prove, especially by being given a promotion that I wasn't necessarily ready for. So as we already know, it's a very white, middle-class industry. However, because I'm not white, middle class, or a man, I unintentionally ended up being quite diverse in how I was approaching my role in comparison to the members in my team. And I ended up using my difference as one of my main commissioning tools. So let's talk about those three elements of diversity that I pointed out. So being a woman in a male team meant that I was looking through a very different lens. And back in 2019, we had the centenary of the Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919. And as a result of that, I developed a Women in Law project where we invited all of our female law authors to contribute to a blog to share their stories and perspectives on the legal landscape. The blog ended up having thousands of hits and created a real sense of support between the publisher, authors, readers around this historical act and important act which paved the way for equal rights. So if I hadn't been in that position, I wonder if there had been a missed opportunity within the commissioning team. I mentioned that I was the only commissioning editor under the age of 30 within that team. Sadly, that's no longer the case. However, because I hadn't been commissioning for years, unlike other members in the team, I experienced a lot of nerves and anxieties around travelling for work, for example, which those members of the team weren't experiencing. I did have a good relationship with my manager and we did talk about it, but I don't feel like I was ever truly honest in how much anxiety I actually felt. So when new commissioning editors came into the team, especially female commissioning editors, I tried to create opportunities to chat about the different aspects of the role, purely to open up the conversation and to offer support to commissioning editors in a way that space hadn't really been created for me. And that's probably why I find it so hard to talk about my anxieties. My point to both of those examples is that if you don't diversify the people in the industry or in your teams, you potentially miss opportunities, and you potentially have a lack of empathy within the environment. So my point around racial diversity is one that I want to talk about in a bit more detail from both the commissioning and industry aspect, and it ties into Paul's point around DEI washing. So I had the privilege of working with an incredible author on a practitioner title around racial equality in the UK workplace when I was a commissioning editor for a diversity and inclusion list. I actually approached the author with the idea, we developed the proposal together, we mapped the chapters, and I even read chapters as she was writing. And both I, the commissioning editor, and the author are women of colour, discussing issues of race in the UK workplace. And as far as I'm aware and can recall, I was the only person of colour in that commissioning team and pretty much the book publishing team. So it felt quite exposing at times, and it increased levels of vulnerability. The commissioning and writing aspects went really well on that project. The rest of the process wasn't as smooth, and the author found that really upsetting. When the dust settled, the team that I was in, we had an away day and we were brainstorming strategies, etc. And we spoke about lessons learnt. And I suggested that we take a closer look at that experience to work out what actually happened and why. And one of the senior leaders said to me, "We should, but you can't get too emotional." And that comment really took me aback, because all throughout that experience I'd been even-tempered, professional, proactive. So heaven forbid I actually told her how I actually felt and how heartbreaking I found that experience. I want to point out that we all have biases, conscious, unconscious. We're all humans, we've all got different lived experiences. However, with a bit of bravery, we can challenge our own biases, we can develop empathy, and we can create safer environments for all colleagues, internal and external. A lot of publishers have created inclusive hiring practices and developed initiatives to attract diverse talent, which is fantastic. Retention, however, will continue to be an issue if that same intention isn't maintained throughout that person's career with that company. People will feel that there is a lack of integrity and sincerity in those hiring practices as a result. It can't be a one model fits all, and I don't think it needs to be. We fall into the creative industries, so we shouldn't be afraid to be creative and, take a few risks, like Paul alluded to earlier. And when it comes to diversity and commissioning, we all have a responsibility to create and maintain safe and empathetic environments for authors, commissioning editors, and everyone involved in the industry. And before I hand over to Delena, Claire mentioned it earlier, I have started a side project which offers free and impartial guidance for budding authors, specifically working on EDI-related topics. And my priority is to guide people who are underrepresented within the industry, as this is where my passion lies. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Iram. And best of luck with Iram, the Little Publisher, which sounds like a really excellent initiative.
Thank you.
Very much look forward to seeing how that goes. Now, over to you, Delena.
Oh, thank you, and thanks for having me. I hope everyone's feeling okay. So since starting as a commissioning editor, I've made it a very deliberate intention, or mission even, to focus on signing people from marginalised communities, people who have existed on the edges of the traditional academic landscape and who have found themselves actively excluded within their own fields and by publishers because of this. The homogenous makeup of those involved in academic publishing, whether editors, academics, journal boards, societies, and peer reviewers, has allowed for gatekeeping to exist within the sector. A certain group of people are deciding what is the right kind of research, methodology, and writing. Texts are overly theoretical to the point where academic work is speaking inwards rather than trickling down into a wider audience. Academics of colour are told that speaking from personal experience is not correct, and yet we know that ethnographic research is perfectly acceptable when a white outsider enters a community to extract data. We are told that an expert is a white man who has sat within academia their entire career and who understands social phenomena through data and quotation. And we are told that successful titles are those which follow the trends of the mainstream market of the global north, and that anything outside of this is not commercially viable. As an editor, I wanted to move away from these preconceived notions in my own work. As an editorial assistant struggling with a high workload and barely making ends meet, something which I'm sure we can all remember, I felt a constant sense of frustration. I love academia and learning, to the point where I've enrolled myself back into university twice. Yet, working on texts that sit across social sciences, I just wasn't seeing myself reflected, not in the authorship nor in the content. In academic publishing, where we are working with research which informs policy and books that fill university libraries, this lack of diversity can result in biased publications that perpetuate hegemonic framing and discriminatory thinking. At the same time, students from marginalized backgrounds can oftentimes find themselves erased in textbooks or made hypervisible through negative stereotypes, ultimately leading to harm from authors who express their biases as academic certainties. As an assistant, I often found myself asking, why are we just focusing on the same types of theorists, and why are we commissioning the same people? It is often the answer given that we do this because we're reflecting the market, and it's our job to be reactive. As an editor, I just don't believe this. I believe our roles have changed vastly, and that we have a social responsibility to be accountable and minimize the harm that academic publishers have historically played a role in perpetuating. What I believe is that we have an opportunity to make a positive, tangible difference and to create books which are inclusive and representative of the readers that pick them up, and to platform those voices which were often pushed to the side. As a new part of my commissioning, I've been working on a series called Social Science for Social Justice. This series has two core goals. The first is to champion and provide a platform for voices of the global majority, who are academics at all levels, students, social activists, and so on, supporting them in responding to urgent issues. The second aim is to offer a new vision of what academic publishing can be, which is accessibly written, inclusive, and which works towards a shared social justice which benefits all. I've commissioned a range of titles which focus on topics such as Islamophobia, African feminism, reproductive justice, sex work, climate crisis, and East and Southeast Asian advocacy. One of the books in this series, African Feminist Praxis, by activist Jessica Horn, is being written as the author felt that when it comes to Black feminism, it is theorists in the US and the global North who are often referenced, whereas African feminists seem to be overlooked. Her book seeks to make that work of African feminists citable within academia, while also discussing the key tenets of that work with chapters on kinship, solidarity, courage, pleasure, care, and memory. Similarly, the British East and Southeast Asian Network are contributing to the series with a book that explores East and Southeast Asian identity in the UK, which isn't highly documented within academia. In terms of how I commissioned for this series, I looked at different networks run by people of colour across various disciplines. I expanded my search to scholar activists and activists who are outside of the academic space, but doing research and work on the ground. I also looked across different social media platforms, digital publications, and zines. I want to move away from commissioning to briefly discuss diversity from another perspective. This year I published a title called How to Build Your Anti-Racist Classroom by Orleen Badu, who was actually on Channel 5 News last night, if you saw her, and she was fantastic. And this book is for classroom teachers. When Orleen signed my copy of her book at the book's launch, she wrote, "Seeing your face in that initial Zoom call, I knew it would be okay. You are the epitome of why we need diverse teams in every system. Seeing you allowed me to believe I could do this." I believe that as academic publishers, we have a social responsibility towards our audience. However, this goes beyond our publications. We cannot talk about diversity without reflecting on ourselves and the people who make up our organizations. To just focus on commissioning and PR opportunities presents an issue of DEI washing, as Paul mentioned in his talk. To be truly committed to diversity, we need to look inwards. I recently researched book editors at different academic publishers and was shocked to see a stark lack of diversity across many organizations. If I were looking from the perspective of someone who wanted to join that organization, I might consider that this isn't a place where I can belong or progress. Similarly, as an academic of colour, one might be wondering if this is another place where they'll face discrimination, barriers, and a perpetuation of white supremacist structures. We need to start seeing that it's a conscious decision to not be inclusive. It's a conscious decision to not think about how to make our publishing more representative of the societies and the audiences that we serve, and to not educate ourselves or do the research to find the people who represent different perspectives. It's a conscious decision to not look inwards and think about how to make the workplace a more equitable space where people who are of the global majority or disabled or from the LGBTQIA+ communities can thrive. We all work at academic publishers, and we have a huge wealth of knowledge and research available at our fingertips, if only we were to make the effort to read it. I'm hoping that by coming to this session, you're making a conscious decision to be more inclusive at both an organisational level and when commissioning. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Delena. That's brilliant. Now we're going to have a short discussion about some of the issues that have come up in the various presentations. So I'm going to start with a question for Delena. You mentioned finding different networks and scholar activists outside of the traditional places that we as commissioning editors would usually think to look. Can you tell us a bit more about that, and what was the most effective thing that you found?
Yeah, I think it's quite a difficult question to put into a short answer, but I tried everything. I spent a lot of time on Instagram looking at what activists were doing. Instagram is a really great space to find people. I spent a lot of time on Twitter because I'm interested in issues of diversity. I was kind of going from place to place, seeing who was talking in newspapers. I was looking at charity organisations as well. The person who is working on the book about sex workers, who's part of the series, is a director at National Ugly Mugs, but is also an academic who did her PhD at York University. So it was trying to find those links of people who may have moved out of academia, but are doing work on the ground and who are really contributing to their communities. It's not an easy, there's no easy answer. You just have to spend a lot of time sat at the computer. You have to spend a lot of time searching. I think also finding those networks run by academics of colour within each discipline, like there's always going to be networks pertaining to different identities. Again, it's finding them, it's looking through and seeing who is part of those networks, and just finding people who are interested in writing. I don't think that was a very clear answer, so I apologise, but a lot of professional stalking, I guess.
Yeah, professional stalking. Yeah, I think that I recognise that. Yes. So that sounds like you really had to put some serious time in, and this is something that I'd like to pick up on with the next point, which is for everybody, how much freedom does everyone think we have as commissioning editors to try and think outside the box in terms of commissioning material and recruiting authors from non-traditional, i.e. non-university contexts, and how much agency can we have as individual commissioning editors in this context, given the systems that we all have to work within. When we were talking about this earlier, Paul raised the issue of time as being a really crucial factor. So perhaps Paul, you'd like to start us off on this.
Oh, sure, I'll try. Yeah, I can only speak for myself, really, but I would say working for a publisher like Bristol, we certainly have the agency, we have the latitude and the scope, but the question is of time. And you mentioned the sorts of systems that we're working with. Peer review is probably the biggest challenge, and there are times when we are, sort of reaching out to communities that wouldn't normally be sort of be within the purview of a lot of academic publishers, sort of practitioner communities, as well as marginalized groups. We have to think about, what sorts of questions we're asking of peer reviewers. How do we evaluate these projects? Because certainly as university presses, we are expected to meet certain kinds of quality standards. So, time and again, my colleagues and I are sort of confronted with the challenge of, are we asking the right sorts of questions? Are we thinking about this correctly? And we know that we need to sort of unentangle a lot of issues there, but the question is, when does one find the time to do this? Because it requires a lot of work, it requires a lot of careful attention and sort of enrolling lots of different stakeholders. But the industry is publishing more and more books each year. That's not slowing down. So when do we really carve out the time to start thinking about how we start to sort of reconstruct the underlying infrastructure of the thing?
Yeah, so just on the peer review point, I do think if you start building diversity into it, you're sort of, I hate to say this, but you're kind of ticking the box in terms of the representation, and it will become a habit. So, for example, when I was on the diversity and inclusion list, I wanted to make sure that I had D&I right from the start all the way through to the end product in all of the processes that I was doing. So peer review, for example, I would make sure that I didn't just have male reviewers, for example. I had a gender mix. I had people from all over the world. I think if you're a global publisher, if you've got global markets, then you should definitely be doing that. And then different levels of seniority as well. I had been schooled to just seek out the professors, people who we've already published, all of that kind of stuff. And you're putting barriers in the way right from day one. So, I made sure that I was reaching out to ECRs and, mid-level career academics as well. So if you make those types of conscious decisions, you're tackling the problems right from the start. So I think that's a practical tip as well in terms of building some more D&I into standard processes.
Delena, do you agree that actually we can have agency, quite a fair bit of agency as commissioning editors on an individual level?
I think it depends on your organisation. I'm very lucky that Sage has really built DEI into their publishing. I've been given a lot of freedom. I think Sage puts up with a lot from me. So I think it really depends on your organisation. If you have, we're very target driven, and that's very challenging to deal with. A lot of the time you're just thinking about the number, not necessarily the diversity within that number. So I think organisations need to empower their commissioning editors. I think they need to support them with targets that are realistic. I think they need to support them with training. I think it's actually no good commissioning using diversity unless you can actually support diverse authors as well. I have authors, because I work on the SEND list and I publish books for teachers, I have authors who are neurodiverse and they work in very particular ways. I ask them, how do you want me to work with you? What do you need from me? I had one author that said, I would like weekly meetings for accountability. That kind of thing is very difficult to embed into your day-to-day work. So I think, if we're going to have diversity on our list, we need to be given the space to do that. So yeah, it really depends on your organisation. And I think something which can be quite challenging, which I completely empathise with, is, the market that you're working within or the discipline. It might not be that diverse a discipline. On the textbook side, I commission within early childhood studies, and it's largely white women. There are very few men actually in the early years. They're, funnily enough, a minority in that space. And there's barely any people of colour. So, when you're faced with that, it's how do I diversify within that? And I think, I've reached out to every person of colour who is working within early childhood studies at an academic level, and they may not all want to write, and a lot of them actually don't, but It's the fact that you're reaching out, you're speaking to them, you're wanting to hear from them. And even if you don't get good commissioning from that in terms of a book, you can still ask them, what do you want to see? What would be more reflective of your students? What are your students finding challenging? And that is bringing diversity again into the kind of hit listing and book creation that you're doing.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so I think we've got just under 10 minutes left, so I think we'll move on to Q&A. So I'm going to open up the floor. Right, do we have the microphones, Laura? I think Simon at the front, if the microphone's coming.
Hi, Simon Holt from Elsewhere. I had a really inspiring conversation a little while ago with an academic at Imperial College, a chemist, and she happens to be neurodiverse, and she was explaining that for her, she has great problems publishing because doing the experiments and stuff is not a problem, but just in terms of her skill set, the writing is a big problem to her, and she was kind of lamenting the lack of options to publish in different formats with publishing houses, whether that's kind of recording a video or kind of interactive models or, you know, just maybe more bite-sized kind of things, because she was saying that writing long-form articles or book chapters just isn't her skill set, but obviously she wants to publish her research. So I wondered what the panel's thoughts were about diversity of formats or product types in terms of a tool to be able to recruit more diverse authors in either books or journals.
I'm happy to take that one. So I think that's a really great point that you raise, and it's really important. So when I was working on the diversity inclusion list at a previous publisher, I definitely wanted to have different types of products, and it was that really holistic kind of, we're not just producing content about D&I, but what we're doing is D&I. So there were talks about audio and Braille at one point as well. I was really keen on Braille, and sadly, those conversations just ended. And unfortunately, as a commissioning editor, there's only so much power you've got in the whole process. So I think they're really important topics, and obviously there are specialist publishers who print in Braille, for example. But I think it is something that a lot of the publishers should be taking on board in terms of the diversity of readership and the market. One of my practitioner authors, when I was in that commissioning role, he really just spoke to me about the fact that he has dyslexia, for example, and what could I do to support that. So similar to what Delana was saying earlier, we had regular calls, I would read chapters, but there are already things that you can do, like you can increase the copy edit level. Like if your authors are communicating with you in a really honest way right from the start, and if you create that sort of safe, empathetic environment, you're probably going to be able to tackle a lot of these issues. So that's my two-piece.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm absolutely not a techno optimist, but I think this is one of those areas in which I do place a bit more faith in digital technology and how we might use it to offer authors different options. And we were aware of the generation of distribution platforms that are coming to the market. And at Bristol, we launched ours last year, Bristol University Press Digital. And at present, it's very much a distribution platform for delivering content. But we are at the stage where we're talking about that next phase of platform development. And how can we use this to begin to sort of imagine different formats. What are the different options that can be given to authors? You know, do they need to be sort of pieces of written content? Can we be thinking about audio, you know, video materials, data sets, what have you? I suppose there's a tension there, though, isn't there? Because there are those sort of very deeply embedded value orientations concerning like what's, you know, what publishers should be doing, what is worthwhile, but perhaps more seriously in the academy, you know, what are the sort of what are the allowable outputs that academics will be judged by? So it kind of goes back to an earlier point about how perhaps that collective action is needed to perhaps work more closely with the academy and to rethink, right, what do we value? What do we hold to be valuable, and how can we imagine it to be otherwise?
Okay, thanks, Paul. Right, next question. Lady at the front.
Yeah.
Hi, Abigail Barkley from Inspired Selection. We heard today just how important that real intention for inclusivity is to retention, allowing anyone from any background to thrive in the workplace. What can we extrapolate from that as publishers to the publishing itself, to the books and the journals, to create a really inclusive market so that a diverse range of books and journals can thrive in the market, and the next book in the series is prioritised, or more articles like that are published? Is there anything we can do systemically to create an inclusive publishing market? Does that make sense?
It's a big question.
Go.
I'm sorry, can I try?
Yeah, go for it, please do.
So, as I said before, I look at publishing holistically. So I look from the moment we're commissioning the book, and where we're commissioning the book, who we're looking for, how we're doing it. Everything has to be intentional at this time. I don't think that there's a fluidity here at the moment, especially in academia. I think everything that we do have to be intentional. And then it also starts with the people within the organization. So you have to look around your group. I spoke to my colleagues earlier about the fact that for the main part of us here in Cambridge, our executive publishers were 3/4 male, white male of a certain age, and how we're looking at that. There's legacy issues, of course. So there's huge ways of looking at what's the barriers. So one of my things have been to educate, full-on education. We don't deal with unconscious bias. We don't use the word unconscious because for us, the idea of it being unconscious is that you're not being intentional. So we do conscious inclusion training for our employees. We have already started a lot of training around LGBTQ+1, 101 courses. We're now going to start a bullying and harassment course. We've done an anti-racism toolkit. So for us, it's about being intentional to train the people within the organization so that when they go out, when they're commissioning, they're able to kind of see what the issues can be, especially if you look around the room. I think that this is mostly the most diverse, one of the most diverse groups of this, this conference, taken away from Simon's group yesterday. That was super, diverse as well. But it's about looking at, who's at the table, who's looking at you, who's being involved with the conversations, and I think it has to be intentional. If that answers your question. Anybody else?
Well, we need to stop shortly. So we've got a lady there.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Sophia Anderson from BJU International. Thank you. Really thought-provoking. Diversity is very varied, and a lot of the commissioning that we do is desk-based commissioning, so searching through websites. And there's lots of diversity that's not visible from a web page, perhaps even a photograph. What can you talk about how we can be more conscious of diversity when commissioning, when perhaps things aren't apparent from the information that we have available to us?
That's a brilliant question.
Yeah.
I've got a small answer for that, and hopefully Delana and Paul and Valerie can pick up on it as well. One thing that I did in the role for the diversity and inclusion list was I adapted my proposal form. So I don't know, obviously any invisible diversity, I'm not going to be able to pick it up, and I'm never going to be intrusive in the way that I approach that and say, tell me everything about you, author, because it's not professional. However, I did have a little section on my proposal form that said, if there's anything that you think you want to share. So I shared a little bit about me, a bit about my career history, how I got to where I was for that role, and basically offered for the author of the proposal form to do the same. If they wanted to do that, great. If they want to share, great. If they don't, equally that's fine. And actually those conversations might come up later. So the author who disclosed that he had dyslexia, I had commissioned that book. We were well into the process. And it was only sort of halfway through that he was like, I do have dyslexia and this is causing me a bit of anxiety. So again, I think it's about creating the space to allow people to come to you instead of you sort of actively pushing for that kind of information, because not everyone does want to share that. They may have things that, they may be neurodiverse, they may be a person of colour, but they may not want to talk about that. And I don't think we should be imposing any of that on anyone.
I'm happy to. I think also on the kind of, a flip side of that, it's finding those groups as well. So going to those spaces and offering yourself as a kind of empathetic editor. So oftentimes within different disciplines, there will be a group within that discipline that is focusing on a particular perspective. I think people from minoritized backgrounds will often find, our tribes, because we don't want to be alone in that. So I think it's finding those spaces, but, go in having had a lot of training, having a lot of self-reflection, and really listening to people and not thinking about the product that you can get at the end of it, but offering yourself as someone that, I am here, I can listen, I can support you in writing your book. So, there will often be those groups as well. And I find that when it comes to research, a lot of people will want to research things that are personally close to them. So I also commission in special educational needs and disabilities. A lot of people who are lecturing within that space or practitioners in that space will have special educational needs and disabilities, and they are interested in that. They want to make a positive difference. So often people can be quite drawn to things that resonate with themselves and their own stories. So looking for research and finding people through that as well. But yeah, agree with what you said, that you can't just go asking invasive questions. There are ways to kind of bring people in without kind of pushing or making them feel uncomfortable.
Fantastic. Right. Well, I think we're basically out of time, and I'm sure everybody would really like to get to the coffee. So there is now a break, and the next session it will be AI, the threats and opportunities for publishers, starting at 4. Thank you very much.